We need to talk about my will.
They thought I was weak.
We're gonna
They
put everything in
forgot
order
I
now.
kept receipts. The dining room table was bare except for a single thick manila folder placed squarely in the center. My son, Michael, and my daughter, Sarah, stared at it as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the polished wood. They had come expecting to discuss my will, to gently nudge me toward decisions that would benefit them. They didn't know that for the past 3 months, I had been conducting a quiet audit of my own life, and that folder contained an itemized list of their betrayals. The meeting was indeed about an inheritance, the one they had already stolen. The scent of rosemary and thyme, the familiar wake of my heavy silver fork, the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, these were the anchors of my Sunday. For 5 years since Arthur's passing, this dinner had been my ritual, a bulwark against the encroaching silence. It was a tradition my children, Ethan and Chloe, claimed to cherish. They would arrive with cheap wine and expensive smiles, filling the old house with a vibrant energy that always felt slightly borrowed, like a coat they couldn't wait to take off. That afternoon, the roast beef was perfect, cooked to a tender pink, just as their father had taught me. Ethan was slicing his second portion when he began. "You know, the Morrisons finally sold," he said, gesturing vaguely with his knife toward the window. "Got nearly double what they paid for it. This neighborhood is on fire." I murmured something noncommittal, focusing on the pattern of the gravy on my plate. I knew where this was headed. It was a path well trodden, a conversation that started with the neighborhood and always ended with me. "It makes you think, Mom," Chloe chimed in, her voice smooth as cream. She placed her hand over mine, her skin cool, her rings clicking softly against my wedding band. "This is such a big place for just one person. All the upkeep, it must be a tremendous burden." A burden. They had been using that word a lot lately. The garden Arthur had spent 30 years cultivating was a burden. The 4 bedrooms that had held their childhoods were a burden. The memories soaked into the very plaster of the walls were, apparently, the greatest burden of all. I looked from my son's calculating gaze to my daughter's mask of gentle concern. They were a perfectly synchronized team, a 2-headed creature speaking with one voice, and its name was entitlement. "We were just talking the other day," Ethan continued, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "It would be so much simpler for you in a managed condo. No stairs, no yard work. We could handle all the financials, set up a simple trust. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." There it was, the offer that was not an offer, but a plan already in motion. They spoke of my life as if it were a business in need of liquidation. They were not seeing me, Helen, the woman who had raised them, who had nursed their fevers and celebrated their triumphs. They were seeing an asset, a collection of accounts and property deeds that needed to be managed. A cold dread, familiar and metallic, settled in my stomach, spoiling the taste of the beef. My gaze drifted past them to the corner of the dining room where Arthur's old roll-top desk stood like a silent sentinel. Its dark mahogany held a lifetime of his meticulous care. Every bill paid, every investment tracked, every warranty filed away in its designated cubbyhole. He used to sit there for hours after dinner, his ledger open under the green glass lamp. "Paper doesn't lie, Helen," he would tell me, tapping a perfectly straight column of numbers with his pen. "People can forget, or choose to forget. Paper always remembers." "Mom, did you hear me?" Chloe's voice pulled me back. Her painted smile was beginning to fray at the edges, a hint of impatience coloring her tone. "We're just trying to look out for you." I looked at my children, really looked at them. I saw the ambition in Ethan's eyes, the same restless fire that kept his tech startups in a perpetual cycle of boom and bust, always funded by a source he was vague about. I saw the desperate need for status in Chloe's carefully curated appearance, from her designer handbag parked by the door to the casual way she name-dropped clients she barely had. They weren't looking out for me. They were looking out for their inheritance, and they had grown tired of waiting for it. I picked up my fork and took a slow, deliberate bite of potato. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to sit in the space their words had created. The air grew thick with their unspoken expectations. Finally, I swallowed and met their eyes. "The roast is good, isn't it?" I said, my voice even. "I think it's the best one I've made all year." The subject was closed, for now. They exchanged a flicker of a glance, a silent communication I was meant to see. It said, "She's not getting it. We'll have to try another way." They left an hour later, kissing my cheek with the dry brush of duty. As I locked the door behind them, the silence that rushed back in was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the chilling echo of their plans and the ghost of Arthur's voice, whispering a warning I had ignored for far too long. Paper always remembers. The unease from Sunday dinner did not fade with the washing of the dishes. It lingered like a damp chill in the air, a low-grade fever in the back of my mind. For 3 days, I moved through the quiet rooms of my house feeling like a visitor, my own footsteps seeming to intrude on a silence that was no longer peaceful. I kept seeing Ethan's knife slicing the beef, hearing Chloe's voice calling my life a burden. The memory of Arthur's words about paper remembering echoed with a new, insistent frequency. Ethan called on Wednesday, not a casual check-in, but a call with a purpose. I could hear it in the forced brightness of his tone. He arrived an hour later, looking artfully disheveled in a way that suggested sleepless nights spent chasing genius. He carried a leather briefcase that seemed too heavy for him and a story of triumph just within his grasp. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, refusing tea, and launched into a breathless monologue about server capacities, user acquisition, and a venture capitalist who was this close to signing. It was a language I didn't speak, a flurry of jargon designed to impress and obscure. I nodded, catching only the emotional undercurrent urgency. "The thing is, Mom," he said, leaning forward and lowering his voice to a conspiratorial hush, "the funding is guaranteed, but it won't land for another 60 days. Bureaucracy, you know. But I have a supplier who needs a deposit now. It's a classic cash flow crunch, just a small bridge." My stomach tightened. I knew the word small in Ethan's vocabulary was a dangerously flexible concept. "And what does that have to do with me?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He opened his briefcase and slid a sheaf of papers across the polished oak. "It's just a formality. The bank needs a guarantor for a short-term loan, just to bridge the gap. It's 60 days tops. The minute the investment comes through, it's paid off. It's a matter of trust." He let the last word hang in the air between us. I looked down at the papers, a dense forest of fine print. My reading glasses were on the mantelpiece, but I didn't move to get them. A cold wave of refusal washed through me, sharp and clear. No. Arthur's voice was so distinct in my head it was almost a sound. Never cosign, not for anyone. "I don't know, Ethan," I began. "Your father was always very clear about—" He cut me off, his expression shifting from eager entrepreneur to wounded son. "Dad? Mom, Dad is the reason I have the courage to do this in the first place." He reached across the table, his hand covering the documents, and by extension, my hesitation. "He always said that family was the only investment that truly mattered. He believed in me. Don't you?" The manipulation was seamless, a blade sliding between my ribs so smoothly I barely felt it go in. He was using my love for his father against me, turning Arthur's prudence into a weapon to dismantle my own. He was painting my caution as a lack of faith, my hesitation as a betrayal not only of him, but of my husband's memory. "Of course I believe in you," I said, the words feeling like a concession, a crack in my resolve. "Then this is nothing," he said, his smile returning, bright and relieved. He flipped through the pages to the very last one, a single sheet with yellow stickies marking several lines. "It's just a signature here and here. It's a standard guarantee. Basically, it just says you trust me." He pushed a pen into my hand. My fingers felt clumsy as they wrapped around it. My eyes scanned the page, but the words swam. I saw phrases like unconditional and irrevocable. At the very top of the page, his thumb was resting on the bolded header, but I could just make out the letters peeking out from underneath, liquication for home equity. Before I could process it, he shifted, pointing to the signature line. "Right there, Mom. That's all they need." Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to get my glasses, to read the words his thumb was so casually obscuring. But I saw the pleading in my son's eyes. I saw the ghost of the little boy who used to run to me for comfort. I felt the immense weight of a mother's lifelong duty to believe in her child, even when that belief felt like stepping off a cliff. My love for him, twisted into a tool of coercion, was stronger than my fear. My hand moved, the pen scratching against the paper. My signature, the one Arthur had always said was my bond, looked frail and spidery on the line. Ethan's relief was immediate and total. He collected the pages with a speed that felt jarring, tucking them safely back into his briefcase. He stood up, kissed my forehead, and his gratitude was as brief as it was effusive. "You're a lifesaver, Mom. I promise you won't regret this." He was gone less than 5 minutes after I signed. The front door clicked shut, leaving a profound and terrible silence in its wake. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the indentation my signature had left on the wooden surface. The chill I'd been feeling for days had settled deep in my bones, no longer a vague premonition, but a cold, hard certainty. I had signed something, and I had a sickening feeling it was not a matter of trust, but a receipt for its destruction. The 2 weeks following Ethan's visit were unnaturally quiet. He didn't call, and I didn't dare to. A part of me didn't want to know the outcome of the papers I had signed. To ask would be to admit the depth of my misgiving, a feeling I was trying to press down like a weed in the garden, hoping it would wither from lack of attention. I tried to lose myself in routine, in the deadheading of roses, the polishing of silver, the methodical rhythm of a life that had once felt secure. But the peace I sought was a phantom. Every time the phone rang, my heart seized. Every official-looking car that passed the house made me flinch. I had signed away a piece of my certainty, and its absence was a hollow ache. Chloe dropped by on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced. This was her way, breezing in on a cloud of expensive perfume, her presence a whirlwind of chatter that filled all the quiet spaces. She brought a small, ridiculously priced orchid in a ceramic pot. "It needs a home with a bit of life, Mom," she said, placing it on the coffee table, where it immediately looked more valuable than anything else in the room. We were having tea when the mail carrier's truck rumbled down the street. The familiar clank of the mailbox lid was a sound I had heard tens of thousands of times, but now it landed with the weight of a gavel. "Oh, I'll get it," Chloe said, jumping up with a bright, manufactured energy. It was a small thing, but she never got the mail. That was my task, my small walk to the end of the drive that punctuated the day. Before I could form a protest, she was already out the door. I watched through the large picture window as she sorted through the handful of envelopes. She paused. Even from that distance, I could see the change in her posture. She held one envelope differently from the others. It was larger, made of thick, cream-colored paper, the kind reserved for important documents. The bank's logo, a stoic blue eagle, was printed in the upper left corner. It felt heavy, even from 50 feet away. When she came back inside, she placed the bills and circulars on the hall table, but kept that one envelope in her hand, holding it against her hip almost possessively. "Anything interesting?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Just the usual junk," she said, her back to me as she slipped off her shoes. Her movements were a study in practiced casualness. "Oh, and this." She held up the envelope for a fraction of a second before tucking it into the side pocket of her leather tote bag. Another one of those quarterly portfolio statements. Pages and pages of numbers and charts that make no sense. "Don't worry, I'll go through it for you later, save you the headache." A spike of pure adrenaline shot through me, cold and sharp. "I can look at it, Chloe." She turned, her face a perfect mask of indulgent patience, the kind one reserves for a slightly confused child. "Mom, honestly, it's my pleasure. It's what I do for my clients, simplify the complicated stuff. You know how Dad used to handle all this. Let me be your Arthur for a little while, okay?" The invocation of her father's name was a low blow, and she knew it. It was meant to soothe and disarm, to remind me that I was no longer capable, that I needed a protector. But all it did was raise the hairs on my arms. Arthur would have handed me the letter. He would have sat down with me, his pen tracing the lines of text, explaining every term until I understood. He would never, ever have taken my mail. My mouth opened to the man she'd give it to me, to assert the simple, fundamental right to my own correspondence. But the words caught in my throat, tangled in decades of habit. I was her mother. She was my competent, successful daughter who moved through the world with an ease I had never mastered. To challenge her now would be to start a conflict, to admit the ugly suspicion festering inside me. It would be an accusation, and the family I had built was not one for open accusations. We dealt in subtleties, in unspoken agreements and gentle manipulations, so I said nothing. I watched her bag, sitting on the floor beside the armchair. The corner of the cream envelope was just visible, a stark white rectangle against the dark leather. It was my letter. My name was on it. It was in my house. And yet, it was 100 miles away. The rest of her visit passed in a blur. She talked about a difficult client, a potential trip to Italy, the rising cost of everything. I nodded and murmured, my entire consciousness fixed on that bag. When she finally stood to leave, she hugged me, her cheek cool against mine. "Take it easy, Mom. I'll call you after I've deciphered that bank nonsense." I stood at the door and watched her drive away, the expensive orchid sitting on my coffee table like a bribe. The house was quiet again, but the silence was different. It was the silence of a room from which something had been stolen. I had let her walk out my door with a piece of my life, and my own weakness, my own conditioned desire to keep the peace, had been the key that unlocked the door for her. Sleep did not come easily in the days after Chloe's visit. I'd lie awake in the dark, my mind replaying the moment she slipped the cream-colored envelope into her bag. The ease of the gesture, the placid smile on her face as she did it, that was what haunted me. It was an act of casual theft, performed not in the shadows, but in the bright afternoon light of my own living room. The violation left a stain on the house's familiar quiet, turning comfort into a source of constant low-level anxiety. A week later, overcome by a wave of loneliness so acute it felt like a physical ache, I found myself drawn to Arthur's study. The room was much as he'd left it, a museum of a quiet, orderly life. I was looking for a specific photograph, one taken on Chloe's 5th birthday. In it, she and a 7-year-old Ethan are sitting on the lawn, their faces smeared with chocolate cake, beaming at their father behind the camera. I wanted to remember them that way. I needed to remember that the calculated strangers who now sat at my dinner table had once been those innocent children. The photo albums were on the bottom shelf of the built-in bookcase. As I pulled a heavy, leather-bound volume from its place, my fingers brushed against the wooden back panel of the shelf. It felt loose. I pushed gently, and to my surprise, the panel gave way, swinging inward on a small hidden hinge. My heart gave a little flutter of surprise. In all our years in this house, I never knew this was here. Inside the dark, dusty recess sat a single object, a thick green accounting ledger, identical to the ones Arthur used for his clients, but with no label on its spine. It felt heavy in my hands, solid and important. I carried it to his desk and sat in his worn leather chair, the cool air of the hidden compartment still clinging to the book. I opened it. The first several pages were a meticulous record of our life together, written in Arthur's precise, elegant script. Every major purchase, every investment, the mortgage payoff date, the value of his life insurance policy. It was a complete financial map of our marriage. Seeing his handwriting, so familiar and yet gone forever, brought a fresh wave of grief. I ran my fingers over the numbers, a testament to a lifetime of his care and protection. Then I turned a page, and the heading at the top read, "Loans to Ethan Chloe." My breath caught. Below, the page was divided into 2 columns, each filled with Arthur's neat entries. It began over a decade ago. Ethan, $5,000, seed money, Innovatech. A few months later, Chloe, $2,500, security deposit, first apartment. The entries continued, page after page. They chronicled every bailed-out business venture, every down payment, every credit card debt quietly erased. Each entry was dated, with the amount and a brief, non-judgmental note. Ethan, $10,000, cover payroll. Chloe, $7,000, exceptional design opportunity. I stared, my mind reeling as I did the rough math. It was a staggering sum, a torrent of support I had only ever been vaguely aware of. To me, they had been individual crises, a series of one-time emergencies. To Arthur, they had been a pattern, one he had documented with the dispassionate clarity of an auditor. He had seen what I had refused to. He had seen the slow, steady drain. As I numbly turned another page of the ledger, a folded document tucked between the sheets slipped out and fell onto the desk. My blood ran cold. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope. The bank's stoic blue eagle was in the corner. It was the letter Chloe had taken. My hands trembled as I unfolded the pages. This was no portfolio update. The header was in large, bold letters. Home equity line of credit, final documentation, disbursement notice. The words swam before my eyes. My name was there, next to Ethan's. The document I'd signed, the one he'd covered with his thumb. It wasn't a small bridging loan. It was a lien against my home. The home Arthur and I had worked our entire lives to own outright. The maximum credit line was listed in stark, unforgiving print, $250,000. And at the bottom of the first page, a sentence was highlighted in pale yellow. Initial disbursement of $50,000 scheduled for transfer on, the date was 2 days from now. The air left my lungs in a single silent gasp. This was it, the final piece. Ethan's urgent need for a signature, Chloe's casual interception of the mail. They weren't separate acts of selfishness, they were a coordinated attack. They had conspired to mortgage my home, the bedrock of my security, for Ethan's failing dream. And Chloe, my daughter, had looked me in the eye and lied to ensure I wouldn't find out until it was too late. I dropped the papers on the desk as if they were burning my skin. The ghost in the ledger was not just Arthur's memory. It was the ghost of the family I thought I had. The innocent children in the photograph were gone, replaced by predators who saw their mother not with love, but with avarice. In the suffocating silence of Arthur's study, surrounded by the evidence of his foresight and their betrayal, something inside me broke. And in its place, something hard and cold and resolute began to form. They thought my love for them was a weakness they could exploit forever. They were about to find out it had been the only thing holding back the storm. For a long time, I just sat there in Arthur's chair, the bank letter spread on the desk blotter like an autopsy report. The shock was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest that made each breath a conscious effort. My family, my life, the very ground beneath my feet, it all felt like a fiction I had been telling myself. The warmth of memory was gone, replaced by the icy reality of the ledger and the letter. I was not a cherished mother. I was a resource, a well they had been drawing from, and now they had decided to poison it to get to the water faster. My gaze fell on the phone. The disbursement was in 2 days. 2 days until $50,000 of my security vanished into the black hole of Ethan's latest venture. My hand shook as I reached for the receiver. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Calling a stranger to report my own son felt like the ultimate betrayal. But what, I asked the silent room, was their betrayal of me? I dialed the number on the letterhead. The voice that answered was professional, detached. I explained, my own voice a reedy tremor, that there had been a misunderstanding, that the line of credit was opened under duress. I didn't use the word fraud. I couldn't. I simply said I did not authorize the initial disbursement and wished to freeze the account immediately. There was a pause, the clicking of a keyboard. The woman on the other end asked for my date of birth, my mother's maiden name, the simple keys to my identity. An identity I suddenly felt I had to fight to reclaim. After a few tense moments that stretched into an eternity, she spoke. "Okay, Mrs. Miller, I've placed a temporary freeze on the account pending review. No funds can be moved. You'll need to come into a branch with identification to make it permanent." I hung up, my body slumping in the chair. The immediate danger was averted. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. It was the first time in years I had said no. That night, I did not go to my bed. The house was too quiet, too full of ghosts. Instead, I stayed in Arthur's study, the green-shaded lamp casting a small, determined circle of light on his desk. His words echoed in my mind, a mantra against the chaos. Paper doesn't forget. He had left me a map. It was time I learned to read it. I pulled out the dusty file boxes from the closet, the ones containing years of my bank statements. Chloe had set up online banking for me a few years back, another simplification of my life. She would check it occasionally, assuring me everything was in order. I had trusted her. I had let my own financial literacy wither like an untended plant. Now I would learn. With Arthur's ledger open on my left and a stack of my statements on my right, I began. At first, it was disorienting, a sea of tiny numbers, debits and credits, cryptic abbreviations. But as the hours passed, a grim rhythm took hold. I started with the large sums, the ones Arthur had documented. I found the corresponding wire transfers from his accounts to theirs, clean and accounted for. That was his money, his to give. Then I turned to the statements from the years after his death. My accounts, my money. I started scanning, my finger tracing each line. I was looking for anomalies, for anything that didn't feel like my life. It started with the ATM withdrawals. I rarely used cash, but there were withdrawals, $200, $300 from machines in neighborhoods I never visited. One was near Ethan's office building. Another was just a block from Chloe's expensive salon. Then came the online transfers, small amounts, always under $500, a psychological threshold I would be less likely to notice or question. Online transfer to E. Miller. Zelle payment Chloe M. The memos were innocuous: dinner, repairs, gift. They were lies written in my own checkbook. I took out a fresh notepad and a pen, and like Arthur, I began to build my own ledger. I drew 2 columns, Ethan and Chloe. I cross-referenced the dates of the transactions with my old calendars. March 12th, transfer to Chloe, $450. Memo, new tires. My calendar showed a note, Chloe called, flat tire, stressed. May 2nd, ATM withdrawal, $300. My calendar, Ethan called, server crashed, needs cash for emergency tech. July 21st, online bill pay to Prestige Interiors, $750. I had never heard of them. A quick search on the computer revealed it was a high-end fabric supplier Chloe used. Page after page, the pattern emerged, insidious and undeniable. It was a death by 1,000 cuts. These weren't loans. This was a secret tax on my love, a stipend they had awarded themselves from my accounts. The grand deceptions, like the home equity line, were built on a foundation of these countless smaller thefts. They had been testing the waters for years, conditioning me to their constant need, blurring the lines between support and subsidy until there were no lines at all. By the time the first pale light of dawn crept through the blinds, the desk was covered in paper. Arthur's ledger, my statements, and now my own notebook, its pages filled with a damning chronicle of their entitlement. There was no grief left in me. It had been burned away by a slow-burning, clarifying rage. Arthur was right. People forget. People lie. But the numbers, the dates, the transfer codes, they were a perfect, preserved record of the truth. Paper doesn't forget, and from that moment on, neither would I. I spent the morning after my long night of accounting in a state of suspended animation. I made coffee I didn't drink and toast I didn't eat. The evidence of my children's betrayal was spread across Arthur's desk, a landscape of deceit. My fury had cooled overnight, leaving behind a hard, dense core of purpose. But purpose without a plan is just wishful thinking. I had stopped the bleeding, but I didn't know how to perform the surgery needed to save myself. I was an amateur investigator, a grieving widow, not a strategist. The world of finance, of legal recourse, was a foreign country whose language I did not speak. I remembered a conversation from years ago at a neighborhood potluck. A woman named Maria, recently widowed herself, had mentioned her own children trying to help with her estate a little too eagerly. She'd spoken in glowing terms of a financial planner who specialized in cases like hers. She doesn't just look at the numbers, Maria had said. She looks at the family dynamics. She gave me my power back. The name had stuck with me, filed away without knowing why. Grace Avila. Finding her was easy. A quick search on the computer brought up Avila Financial Strategies, its website professional and discreet. The tagline read, "Guiding you to a secure and independent future." The word independent resonated so deeply, it was almost a physical blow. I picked up the phone, my heart racing with a different kind of fear now. Not the fear of confrontation, but the fear of asking for help, of admitting to a stranger how badly I had let things go. I booked a consultation for the next day using my maiden name. I told the receptionist I was exploring retirement options. The lie felt flimsy, but necessary. I couldn't risk Chloe or Ethan finding out. I spent the rest of the day carefully photographing each page of Arthur's ledger and my own notebook with my phone, creating a digital record I could take with me. I placed the originals back in the hidden compartment behind the bookshelf, a secret arsenal waiting to be deployed. The office was in an unassuming building downtown, the kind with a quiet lobby and a hushed elevator. Grace Avila was not what I had expected. She was a sharp, energetic woman in her late 40s with warm, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She didn't lead me to a large, intimidating boardroom, but to a small, private office with comfortable chairs and a pot of tea brewing on a side table. She listened. For nearly an hour, she just listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't jot down notes, just held my gaze with a focused, compassionate intensity. I told her everything, my voice steady as I recounted the Sunday dinner, the co-signed loan, the intercepted letter, the long night with the ledgers. I laid out the story not as a hysterical mother, but as a client presenting a case. The act of speaking the facts aloud to an impartial third party cemented their reality. They were no longer just a family drama, they were a series of calculated financial transgressions. When I finished, the silence in the room was profound. I expected judgment or pity. Instead, Grace Avila leaned forward slightly and said 4 words that felt like a lifeline. "I believe you, Helen." The relief was so immense, I felt my carefully constructed composure begin to crumble. She hadn't questioned my story, hadn't suggested I might be confused or exaggerating. She had validated me. "And," she continued, her voice firm but kind, "you should know that what you're describing is not a simple family squabble. This is a classic pattern of elder financial exploitation. The manipulation, the use of trust, the gradual erosion of your financial boundaries. I've seen it hundreds of times. You are not alone, and you are not powerless." Hearing it named, exploitation, was liberating. It took the shame and confusion I felt and placed it in a clinical context. It wasn't a personal failing, it was a recognized tactic. Grace then turned to a whiteboard on the wall and picked up a marker. "Okay," she said, her tone shifting from empathetic listener to clear-eyed strategist. "Let's build you a fortress. Today, right now." For the next hour, she laid out a clear, step-by-step plan. Each action was designed to take back control, to cut the lines of access my children had so carefully cultivated. First, a new bank account at a completely different institution, one to which only I had access. All my direct deposits, pension, Social Security were to be rerouted there immediately. Second, a full lockdown. We would change every password to every online account I had using a new secure email address she helped me create on the spot. Third, we would formally notify my current bank in writing of the fraudulent loan application and revoke any and all permissions Ethan or Chloe had on my accounts. Fourth, and most critical, she gave me the name of an estate lawyer, Marcus Thorne. "He specializes in this," she said. "You need to see him tomorrow to revoke their power of attorney, I'm assuming they have it, and establish a new trust, one with an independent trustee." I left her office 2 hours later, clutching a folder with a neatly typed checklist. The world outside seemed brighter, the city noise less jarring. I was still afraid, but it was a different kind of fear. It was the sharp, focused fear of a soldier preparing for battle, not the formless dread of a victim waiting for the next blow. Grace Avila hadn't just given me a plan, she had given me back my own sanity. She had looked at the mess of my life and seen not a helpless old woman, but a woman with rights, a woman with resources, and a woman who was finally ready to fight back. EOT following Grace Avila's checklist became my secret, full-time job. I moved through the tasks with a methodical precision that would have made Arthur proud. I opened the new bank account, a simple act that felt like establishing a sovereign nation. I visited my old bank, my voice clear and firm as I signed the papers to freeze the home equity line permanently. The young teller looked at me with a flicker of concern, but I offered no explanation. My family's business was no longer his or anyone else's. The most daunting task on the list was the digital cleanup. Years ago, Ethan had set up a shared family cloud account. "For photos, Mom," he'd said, "and important documents, everything in one safe place." It was sold to me as a convenience, a modern family album. Now, Grace's words echoed in my ears. If they have access to it, assume it's compromised. Change the password, then check the activity logs and archives. See what they've been sharing. That evening, I sat at Arthur's desk. My new password, a complex, meaningless string of letters and numbers Grace had taught me to create, written on a slip of paper. Logging in felt like breaking into my own home. The main folder was filled with the things I expected: vacation photos, scanned copies of birth certificates, Chloe's design portfolio. It was all so wholesome, so perfectly curated. But Grace had told me to look deeper, in the places no one ever cleaned out. I found the archive folder, then a subfolder labeled sync, and inside that, a collection of phone backups. Ethan's iPhone, Chloe's iPhone. It seemed that in their haste to set up the shared account, they had inadvertently synced their text message histories to the cloud. My fingers hovered over the files, a cold sense of dread and morbid curiosity warring within me. I clicked. The files opened into a searchable database of their private conversations. I started by searching my own name. The results flooded the screen. Reading them felt like pressing my ear to a door and hearing my own eulogy being planned. It was all there, in stark black and white. Their voices, stripped of the gentle concern they used to my face, were cynical, dismissive, and utterly unified in their objective. A thread from 6 months ago, around the time they started talking about the burden of my house. Chloe, Sunday dinner again. She's getting slower. Spent 10 minutes looking for the salt. Ethan, is she still rattling around in that mausoleum? We need to accelerate the condo plan. Talk up the security angle. She'll bite. Chloe, I'll lay it on thick. The "we're so worried about you" routine always works. My breath hitched. They rehearsed. They strategized their emotional attacks like generals planning a siege. I kept scrolling, my heart turning to a small, hard stone in my chest. A conversation from the week before, Ethan asked me to co-sign the loan. Ethan, the VC is stalling. I'm going to have to hit the family bank. It's time. Chloe, the whole HELOC? Are you sure? That's the big one. Ethan, it's now or never. I'll handle her. I'll bring up Dad. That's the kill shot. Chloe, okay, and I'll make sure the bank docs don't end up in her hands. She'll never even know what she signed. The kill shot. He had called his father's memory the kill shot. And Chloe had been his accomplice from the start, not just a passive beneficiary, but an active co-conspirator. The intercepted letter wasn't a spontaneous act of control. It was a pre-planned piece of the puzzle. I felt a wave of nausea. This was worse than the financial ledgers. The ledgers showed what they had done. This showed who they were. It revealed the profound, bottomless contempt they held for me. In their private world, I was not their mother. I was an obstacle, a piggy bank with a fading memory, a problem to be managed. The most damning evidence was in a shared notes file titled Leverage. It was a cold, bullet-pointed list. Dad's memory, high impact. Her fear of being alone, a burden. Her lack of tech financial knowledge. Guilt re our childhoods, sacrifices made. It was a playbook for my own emotional destruction, written by my children. They had cataloged my vulnerabilities, my deepest loves and fears, and weaponized every single one of them. I sat back, the glow of the monitor illuminating the dark study. There was no more room for doubt, no space left for the maternal instinct to make excuses for them. The digital echoes of their conversations were louder and clearer than any words they had ever spoken to my face. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a conspiracy. I began to take screenshots, methodically documenting every incriminating exchange. Each click of the mouse was a nail being hammered into the coffin of the family I thought I had. I was no longer just building a fortress to protect myself. I was gathering the evidence I would need to prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the people who called me mom were strangers who had been robbing me blind for years, not just of my money, but of the truth. The morning I was scheduled to meet with Marcus Thorne, the lawyer Brace Avila had recommended, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. The frantic energy of discovery had settled into a quiet, unshakable resolve. I dressed with care, choosing a simple navy blue dress, the one Arthur always said made me look distinguished. I was not going to this meeting as a victim. I was going as the CEO of my own life, preparing for a necessary and long overdue corporate restructuring. Marcus Thorne's office was the physical embodiment of stability. The walls were lined with leather-bound books that smelled of aged paper and authority. He was a man in his 60s with a kind, craggy face and a handshake as solid as the oak desk that separated us. Grace has already briefed him on the basics of my situation, for which I was grateful. It spared me the pain of retelling the whole sordid story from the beginning. "Helen," he said, after we'd exchanged pleasantries, his voice a calm baritone. "Grace has given me the outline. Before we discuss solutions, I need to see what you have." Wordlessly, I slid a slim binder across the desk. It contained everything. Printouts of the bank statements with my annotations, copies from Arthur's ledger, and a dozen pages of the most damning text message screenshots, each one a small, pixelated monument to my children's treachery. He spent the next 20 minutes reading in complete silence. He didn't grimace or gasp. His expression remained neutral, professional, but I saw a muscle tighten in his jaw. When he was finished, he closed the binder, folded his hands on top of it, and looked me directly in the eye. "This is comprehensive," he said, the single word carrying more weight than a dozen expressions of sympathy. "The pattern is clear, and the intent is undeniable. You have every right to protect yourself. The question is, how thoroughly do you wish to do it?" "Completely," I said, my voice leaving no room for doubt. "I want to build a wall so high and so thick they will never get their hands on another penny that I do not explicitly choose to give them. I want to undo every legal tie that gives them a claim to my life." He nodded slowly. "Very well. Then we have 3 primary tasks today. First, we revoke their existing powers of attorney for both financial and health matters. Second, we create a new, revocable living trust for all your major assets. Third, we draft a new last will and testament that reflects your current wishes." He explained the process with meticulous clarity. Revoking the POA was a simple form, but its effect was immediate and absolute. It was like changing the locks. The trust was more complex. By placing my house, my investments, and my primary bank accounts into a trust, I was creating a legal entity. I would be the primary beneficiary, but I would no longer be the sole trustee. "This is the most critical part," Marcus explained. "We will name you as the acting trustee, so you retain full control. However, we will name a successor trustee, someone who takes over if you are incapacitated or pass away. This person must be unimpeachable. I would suggest Grace Avila. Her professional duty as a fiduciary would legally bind her to act only in your best interest." It was a brilliant move. The thought of Grace, with her sharp mind and unwavering ethics, standing as a bulwark for my estate, brought a profound sense of security. Ethan and Chloe had been counting on my eventual decline, waiting to step in with the POA I had foolishly signed years ago. This new structure would slam that door shut forever. The last piece was the will. My old will, drafted when Arthur was still alive, had divided everything equally between our 2 children. Marcus brought a fresh document up on his screen. "Helen, what are your wishes now?" I thought of the years of financial siphoning, of the emotional manipulation, of the words "kill shot" in a text message. I thought of the profound disrespect for me, for Arthur, for everything we had built. A part of me, the raw, wounded part, wanted to cut them out completely, to leave them with nothing but the shock of their disinheritance. But revenge felt small, an emotion that would only tether me to them longer. Dignity was more important. "I will leave them each $1, I said, the words tasting strange and powerful. And I want a specific clause included, stating that this is not an oversight, but a deliberate choice made in full mental capacity, reflecting the nature of my relationship with them in my later years." Marcus Thorne looked at me for a long moment, then gave a slight approving nod. "The in terrorem clause. It's legally sound. It makes the will much harder to contest." For the next hour, he drafted the documents while I sat in the quiet of his office, the weight of my decisions settling into my bones. When he was done, he printed them, the thick paper warm from the printer. He laid them out on the desk, a series of places marked for my signature. He handed me a heavy blue ink pen. I picked it up. My hand was perfectly steady. The first signature revoked the power of attorney. With a simple stroke, I erased their legal authority over my life. The second created the trust, placing my assets behind a wall of legal protection with Grace Avila as its guardian. The third was the will, a final, definitive statement of my independence. Each signature felt different from the one I had given Ethan in my kitchen. That one had been an act of capitulation, born of guilt and manipulated love. These were acts of rebellion, of reclamation. I wasn't just signing documents, I was rewriting my future, and in doing so, I was finally, truly honoring Arthur's legacy of protection. I didn't have to wait long. The initial disbursement from the home equity line had been scheduled for a Friday. I spent that day pruning the roses in the front garden, my hands protected by Arthur's old leather gloves. Every snip of the shears felt decisive, cutting away the dead wood to allow for new growth. I was waiting for the phone to ring or for a car to screech to a halt at the curb. I knew the moment the bank informed Ethan that the funds were frozen, he would come running. The wall I had built was about to be tested. They arrived just after 5 o'clock as the sun began to cast long shadows across the lawn. Ethan's car pulled into the driveway so fast that gravel crunched and sprayed against the garage door. He didn't even park properly. Both he and Chloe got out, slamming their doors in unison, their movements jerky and furious. This was not a social call. I met them at the front door, not opening it fully, but standing in the threshold, my hand on the doorknob. The sight of me, calm and weighing, seemed to enrage them further. "What did you do?" Ethan demanded, his voice a low growl. There was no greeting, no preamble. His carefully constructed veneer of the brilliant, beleaguered sun had been scorched away, revealing the raw entitlement beneath. "I don't know what you mean, Ethan," I said, my voice perfectly level. Inside, my heart was a frantic drum, but I would not let them see it. "Don't play dumb with me, Mom," he snapped, taking a step closer. "The bank, the loan, they said the account is frozen. They said you called them. My funding just fell through because of you." Chloe pushed past him, her face a mask of theatrical disbelief and hurt. "Mom, what is going on?" "Ethan's contact at the bank called him. He said you sounded confused on the phone, that you were talking nonsense about fraud. Are you feeling all right? Have you been taking your medication?" It was the opening salvo of their classic attack, gaslighting. The leverage document had listed her fear of being seen as mentally incompetent. They were running their playbook, but I had read the playbook. I knew every move. I simply looked at her, my expression unchanging. I didn't defend myself. I didn't rise to the bait. My silence was a void where her accusations were supposed to land, and they simply dissipated, unable to find purchase. Her frustration mounted. "We are worried about you. You're not thinking clearly. You've just jeopardized Ethan's entire future over some senior moment." "This has nothing to do with a senior moment," I said, my voice cutting through her manufactured hysteria. "It has to do with my signature on a document I was not permitted to read." The directness of the statement stunned them into a brief silence. Ethan recovered first, his anger shifting to a venomous sarcasm. "Oh, I see. So now I tricked you? After all I've done, all the time I spend trying to make something of myself, something Dad would be proud of? This is the thanks I get? You'd rather I just fail?" "Your father would be ashamed of you," I said, the words falling like chips of ice into the humid evening air. The truth of it was so absolute that it silenced him again, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. He had used his father's memory as a kill shot against me. I was merely returning the bullet. Chloe, seeing her brother falter, tried a different tactic. She softened her voice, her eyes welling with crocodile tears. "Mom, please, we're your family. We love you. If you're scared or confused, you can talk to us. You don't have to listen to outsiders. Has someone been putting ideas in your head? That new friend of yours from the garden club? Some of those women are vultures." I thought of Grace Avila's calm competence, of Marcus Thorne's quiet authority. They were my allies, the professionals I had hired to protect me from my own children. The accusation that I was being manipulated by others coming from them was an irony so bitter it was almost comical. I remained silent. I let them exhaust themselves, their accusations growing wilder, their voices louder. They called me paranoid. They called me ungrateful. They called me cruel. The words washed over me, a storm of noise that couldn't touch the quiet, solid center I had found within myself. I was the unmovable wall they had just crashed into at full speed. Finally, Ethan played his last card. "Fine," he spat, his face red with fury. "Be like that. But don't forget I have power of attorney. If you're going to act like a child, I'll have to treat you like one. I can and I will manage your affairs for you." He delivered the line like a death sentence, the ultimate threat. It was meant to terrify me, to remind me of the power I had given him. He was waiting for me to crumble. I looked from his furious face to Chloe's tear-streaked angry one. And for the first time in this entire exchange, I allowed myself a small, cold smile. "No, Ethan," I said softly. "You don't. EOT." My small smile and quiet declaration that Ethan no longer held power of attorney broke something in them. The fury evaporated, replaced by a stunned, disbelieving silence. They stared at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. I had disrupted the established order of things, overturned the game board just as they were about to declare victory. They left without another word, not in a storm of anger, but in a cloud of confusion. I let the silence settle for a full week. I knew they were scrambling, likely making calls to lawyers of their own, trying to understand what had happened. Let them. Let them spend their own money to discover the truth. The fortress I had built with Grace and Marcus was legally sound and utterly impenetrable. They would find no way in. Then, on a Tuesday morning, I called them both. I kept my voice neutral, even a little frail. "I'd like you both to come for dinner on Sunday," I said. "There are some things we need to discuss about my health and my plans for the future." I could hear the gears turning on the other end of the line. A discussion about my health, plans for the future. To them, this could only mean one thing. I had been scared back into line. My brief rebellion was over, and I was ready to capitulate. It was the perfect bait. After a moment of feigned hesitation, they both agreed to come. Chloe even offered to bring a dessert, her voice dripping with the false sweetness I now found so repulsive. "Of course, Mom, we'll be there. We're always here for you." Sunday arrived, a cool, overcast afternoon that suited my mood perfectly. I did not cook a roast. The oven remained cold. I did not set the table with my good china or polish the silver. Instead, I prepared the dining room as one would prepare a courtroom. I removed the floral centerpiece, the placemats, the salt and pepper shakers. The long, polished mahogany surface, a place that had hosted decades of laughter and celebration, was stripped bare. It looked stark, severe, and unfamiliar. In the precise center of the table, equidistant from every chair, I placed a single thick manila folder. It was the binder I had prepared for Marcus Thorne, now containing even more documentation, copies of the POA revocation, the new trust agreement, the will. It sat on the gleaming wood not as a piece of correspondence, but as an artifact, a piece of evidence waiting to be presented. I was sitting in my usual chair at the head of the table, my hands resting calmly in my lap when I heard their car in the driveway. I didn't get up. I let them use their own keys, a privilege I would soon be revoking. They entered together, Chloe carrying a store-bought apple pie in a box, a peace offering for a war she didn't know she had already lost. They stopped short in the archway of the dining room, their cheerful, practiced smiles faltering as they took in the scene. The empty table, the cold, silent room, me sitting alone, watching them. The folder. "Mom?" Chloe asked, her voice uncertain. "What's this? We thought we were having dinner." "Sit down," I said. It was not a request. The atmosphere was thick with a new kind of tension, utterly alien to this house. It was not the familiar low-level stress of their veiled manipulations, but the sharp, cold pressure of an impending verdict. They moved to their usual seats, their movements hesitant, like animals sensing a trap. Ethan placed his briefcase on the floor beside him. Chloe set the pie down on the sideboard as if it were a bomb. They both stared at the folder. It was the only object in the vast expanse of the table, drawing their focus like a magnet. "You said you wanted to talk about your health," Ethan said, attempting to seize control of the narrative, to steer the conversation back onto his preferred territory. "I did," I replied, my voice calm and even. "I've been doing a great deal of thinking about my well-being, my financial health, my emotional health, and I've come to realize they've both been suffering from a rather serious, long-term illness." I let my gaze drift from Ethan's face at Chloe's, then back to the folder between them. I didn't need to raise my voice. The setting had done all the work for me. The stage was set, the audience was seated, and the evidence was waiting. This was not going to be a family dinner. It was going to be an audit, and for the first time, I would be the one holding the ledger. EOT. I reached out with both hands and drew the manila folder toward me. The soft scraping sound it made against the polished wood was the only noise in the room. My children watched my every move, their apprehension radiating across the table. I untied the small string clasp and opened it. The quiet authority of the gesture was absolute. This was my meeting, my agenda. "As I was saying," I began, my voice calm and measured, "I have been reviewing the state of my affairs." I removed the first document and placed it on the table. It was a photocopy of a page from Arthur's ledger. "This is your father's accounting of the financial support he gave you both over the years. I'm sure you recognize the entries." Ethan and Chloe leaned forward slightly. I saw a flicker of recognition, then confusion in their eyes. This was old history. "He was a generous man," I continued, my voice devoid of emotion. "He believed in giving his children every advantage." I then took out my own spiral notebook, the one filled with my frantic late-night accounting. I placed it beside the ledger. "This is my own accounting for the 5 years since his death." I slid the first of my annotated bank statements across the table toward Ethan. I had highlighted a specific ATM withdrawal. "On this date, $300 was withdrawn from my account at a bank near your office. My calendar for that day says you called me, distraught, because a server had crashed. Do you recall that?" Ethan stared at the paper, his face paling. He said nothing. I turned to Chloe and slid a different statement toward her. And on this date, a transfer of $450 was sent from my account to yours. The memo says new tires. My calendar says you called me, stranded on the side of the road. Chloe's practiced composure began to crack. A faint blush crept up her neck. Mom, I don't see what this has to do with anything. We were in trouble. You helped us. Did I? I asked, my voice still quiet. Or did you simply help yourselves? I let the question hang in the air for a moment before continuing. I presented the evidence piece by piece, not with anger, but with the dispassionate precision of a prosecutor. I showed them the bill paid to the fabric supplier. I showed them the Zelle payment for the spa weekend Chloe had claimed was a work trip. I showed them a dozen other small, insidious transactions, each one a tiny betrayal, a thread in a tapestry of deceit. With each new document, their defenses crumbled. The color drained from their faces. They had no answers because the paper held the truth they could not deny. Then I brought out the bank letter for the home equity line of credit. I placed it directly between them. And then there is this, the small bridging loan, the final documentation that you, Chloe, so helpfully intercepted for me. Finally, I took out the last set of papers, the printed screenshots of their text messages. I fanned them out like a poker hand. I believe you called it the kill shot, Ethan, using your father's memory to get my signature. And you, Chloe, assured him that you would make sure I never knew what I'd signed. You strategized, you rehearsed your concern. You even compiled a list of my emotional vulnerabilities to better leverage them. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own steady breathing. They were utterly exposed, their secret collaboration laid bare on the dining room table. There was nowhere to hide. I gathered the papers back into a neat stack. I looked at my children, at these two adults who had been born of my body and nurtured in this house, and I felt a profound and desolate sorrow, not for me, but for them, for the poverty of their spirits. This is not a negotiation, I said, my voice hardening for the first time. This is a notification. I placed the final 3 documents on the table. This is a legally filed revocation of any and all powers of attorney you previously held for me. This is the cover page for a new irrevocable trust into which all my assets, including this house, have been placed. My financial advisor, Miss Grace Avila, is the successor trustee. And this, I said, placing the last page on top, is my new last will and testament, in which you are both named and left the sum of $1 each, with a clause clarifying that this is a deliberate and considered choice. I stood up. The meeting was over. The financial support has ended. The locks on this house will be changed tomorrow. Any future communication will be conducted through my lawyer, Mr. Marcus Thorne. His card is in the folder. I looked at them one last time, at their shocked, shattered faces. They were no longer the confident, entitled predators who had walked in an hour ago. They were just 2 people who had gambled everything on the belief that I was weak and had lost it all. EOT. For a moment after I finished speaking, there was no sound at all. Just the 3 of us, frozen in a tableau of ruin. Then the shock shattered, and the room filled with the ugly sound of their unraveling. It was Chloe who broke first, not with anger, but with a desperate last-ditch attempt at the old manipulation. Her face crumpled, and she began to sob, harsh, ragged sounds that held no real grief. "Mom, how could you?" she wailed, reaching a hand across the table. "After everything, we are your family." I did not move. I did not respond. The word family, coming from her lips, was now a grotesque parody, stripped of all meaning. Ethan's reaction was pure, undiluted rage. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "This is insane," he sputtered, his face a blotchy crimson. "She's been manipulated. Someone got to her. This isn't legal. You can't do this." He pointed a trembling finger at me. "I'll fight this. We'll see you in court. We'll prove you're incompetent." "Will you?" I asked, my voice still quiet. "Will you use the text messages in which you plan to exploit my lack of tech financial knowledge as evidence of my incompetence? Please do." His mouth snapped shut. The threat was empty, and we both knew it. I had the receipts. They fell apart then, a tandem of disbelief and fury. They accused me of cruelty, of betrayal, of losing my mind. Their words, which had once been precision weapons designed to pierce my conscience, were now just noise. They were stones thrown against the thick, shatterproof glass of the truth. They could no longer hurt me. I remained seated, a still point in their vortex of desperation. I watched them as one might watch a distant storm, acknowledging its power but feeling none of its reign. Finally, their energy spent, they stumbled from the room. Chloe forgot her apple pie on the sideboard. Ethan grabbed his briefcase. The front door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot, a definitive final end. And then silence. It was a new kind of silence. For 5 years, the quiet in this house had been a hollow thing, a space defined by Arthur's absence. It had been filled with loneliness, with the phantom echoes of my children's needs and demands. But this silence was different. It was solid. It was clean. It was mine. Slowly, I stood and began to clear the table. I gathered the documents, the itemized list of my own liberation, and placed them back in the folder. I ran my hand over the smooth, bare wood of the dining table. It was just a table again, not a battlefield. I walked to the sideboard and picked up the pie box. Without a moment's hesitation, I carried it to the kitchen and dropped it into the trash can. I moved through the rooms of my home that was now truly and completely mine. I saw the armchair where Arthur used to read, the scuff marks on the floor where the children had raced their toys, the window I had looked through while waiting for them to come home from school. These memories were not erased, but they were recontextualized. They were part of a story that was now over. A new story was beginning, and its author was me. I ended in Arthur's study. The green-shaded lamp cast a warm glow on his desk. I didn't feel his absence as a loss anymore, but as a presence, a quiet legacy of care that I had finally learned to provide for myself. He had left me the tools, the ledger, the warning. He had trusted that, when the time came, I would be strong enough to use them. It had taken me a long time, but I had not let him down. I stood at the window, looking out at the twilight descending on my garden. I knew this was not a fairy tale ending. There would likely be angry calls from lawyers, bitter messages, attempts to rally other family members to their cause. The conflict would have aftershocks, but the war for my own mind, my own home, my own future, that war was won. The feeling was not triumph. There is no joy in amputating a part of your own life, even if it is diseased. It was not revenge, which is a hot, messy emotion that only burns the one who holds it. It was peace, a profound, quiet, and deeply earned peace. It was the feeling of standing on solid ground after a long and terrifying storm. For decades, my name had been a title, a function, mom, a name to be called out in times of need, a source to be drawn from, a role to be played. In the deep, resonant quiet of my reclaimed house, I could hear a different sound. It was the sound of my own name, Helen. Not a title, not a function, but a person, and she had the rest of her life to live. Helen's journey is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about enduring mistreatment, but about having the courage to reclaim your own narrative. It shows us that dignity is not something others can give or take away. It is something we must build and defend for ourselves. Her story isn't one of revenge, but of a quiet, profound return to self, proving it's never too late to hear the sound of your own name. Thank you for joining us for this powerful conclusion on Sylora Stories. Helen's path from quiet endurance to strategic action was filled with difficult moments. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe was the single most critical piece of evidence that gave Helen the undeniable strength to see her children for who they truly were? Take care, and we'll see you in the next story. Get ready to meet a man who discovers his late wife's will contains one final shocking secret that will either unite his fractured family or tear it apart forever.